The original Killzone was a game filled with potential that unfortunately it largely didn't live up to. Whilst I enjoyed it back in 2004, I was also only 7 years old, and after revisiting it for the first time since then a couple of weeks ago, the game's problems were made apparent. Killzone set up such an interesting, intriguing world, but between some awkward controls and failing to capitalize on the story's potential, it was clear why it did not live up to expectations, even though I still did enjoy the nostalgia. Luckily for fans of Killzone, like myself, the game's marketing managed to make the game sell, which meant it was all but guaranteed we would see a sequel. Killzone 2 and 3 are the games that inspired this series of retrospectives because my nostalgia for these games is through the roof. From memory, Killzone 2 took the criticism of the original game and made sure it was improved, leaving us with a game that felt great to play and a story that further expanded on the original. Again though, from memory. So let's put that nostalgia and memory to the test and see how Killzone 2 holds up today. In this video we'll be going over Killzone 2's development, story and gameplay, but unfortunately not the multiplayer as the servers were closed a couple of years ago. I know there was almost no chance of anyone still playing this mode, but the multiplayer was a good time, so I would have liked to revisit this aspect, but what can you do? Anyway, let's put Killzone 2 through the nostalgia test. This is my retrospective on Killzone 2.
We decided to basically put all of our eggs in one basket and do one thing very well and not be distracted by other genres and other things. And then that project became increasingly important to PlayStation and they wanted to make it bigger because originally, and not very many people know that, Killzone was set out to be a budget title.
Killzone 2 began development just after the release of Killzone in 2004, originally being created for the PS2. After the release of the original Killzone was met with mediocre reviews, Guerrilla Games had their own displeasure with their development process for the game, and so had a look internally at themselves and decided for Killzone 2 to create a video to help them with their development process this time around. This video brings me to E3, a convention now known where a lot of developers show off trailers for games to hype up the masses, but then face the downgrade backlash later on. Ubisoft is now infamous for these, but back in 2005 we had a much more innocent mindset. E3 2005 was an event to hype up the next generation consoles in the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3, and Guerrilla's video for Killzone 2 was used at this event to hype up the power of the PS3. Whilst people at Guerrilla assumed many would know the video was pre-rendered, when Sony officials came out and said it was Killzone 2 running on the PS3, understandably Guerrilla began to worry as they had rendered a grand total of a triangle at that point. It did eventually come out that this video wasn't running on the PS3, and looking back on it today, well, that's obvious. But the reaction garnered from the trailer did prompt Guerrilla to scrap the PS2 project and focus on making Killzone 2 for the PS3. Killzone 2 would not be Guerrilla's next game after Killzone though, and instead in 2006, Killzone Liberation was released for the PSP. I don't have much else to say about the game, I didn't play it really back in the day, and this footage you're watching is probably the most I've played the game. But that's what Guerrilla released in the 5-year gap between Killzone in 2004 and Killzone 2's eventual release in 2009. Guerrilla Games knew they needed to get Killzone 2 right, and when looking back on Killzone's development, they knew they needed more manpower, and so for Killzone 2 ended up almost tripling the studio's size, and ensuring everyone this time around had dedicated roles instead of going between different aspects of development. Guerrilla, now also owned by Sony, had much more resources to tap into, other studios to talk to, like Insomniac and Naughty Dog, and with these newfound resources along with the bigger studio, Killzone 2 could live up to Guerrilla's original expectations. Obviously, the more gameplay and trailers released, the more talk of downgrading occurred due to the high expectations from 2005. But after 5 years of development, Killzone 2 released in February 2009 to massive critical acclaim. But sales initially weren't as expected, whether it was due to downgrading or people's disappointment of the original, but it would go on after the reviews were out to sell quite well. Guerrilla had realized Killzone's potential, and like I said in the beginning, my memories of this game are nothing but positives. So let's see how it holds up now, 11 years later.
My people, sons and daughters of Helghan, this much I vow. The history of these days will be written in blood. By crushing the armies of our enemy, by seizing the weapons they thought to turn against us, we were fighting for our very existence.
Killzone set up the war between the Helghast and the ISA, introducing us to both factions as the Helghast attacked Vector. But in terms of the game's story, we helped push the Helghast off Vector, but really all our cast of characters accomplished was stopping an ISA snake working for the Helghast, because Visari is still very much alive and the Helghast are still in full force. We are still at war. Killzone 2 begins with yet another badass introduction cutscene setting up the game's plot. In retaliation for the Helghast attack on Vector, the ISA is bringing the fight to Helghan, with the goal of arresting Emperor Visari for his war crimes, and the Helghast aren't going to take this attack lying down, because if Killzone was a battle, Killzone 2 is an all-out war. The attack on Helghan is led by now Colonel Templar, as we now assume the role of Sergeant Sevchenko, or Sev, and Alpha Squad led by Rico and new characters Garza and Natko, as the series says bye-bye to Luga and Haka, which is a little disappointing. We begin to push the Helghast back despite stiff resistance once we land on Helghan, but before we can complete our assault on Visari's palace, Colonel Radek, the commander of the Helghast army, and winner for Best World War II villain lookalike, activates a string of arc towers that kills hundreds of ISA and halts our momentum. Alpha Squad begins to learn about this Helghast technology that enables them to generate and channel electricity through a mineral called petrosite, and we learn where the Helghast are gathering this mineral. But as we arrive at the mines, Sev and Rico separate from the rest of the squad, which allows Radek's men to capture the squad, leaving Sev and Rico to go and save them. Radek captured Alpha Squad in the hopes of learning the launch codes for nuclear warheads the Helghast had taken, but with the threat of death as punishment, Rico intervenes on the interrogation and through his brashness results in Garza being killed, which Sev doesn't like.
Sev, back off. Back the fuck off.
Whoa, take it easy.
But before they can brawl it out, a surprise Helghast attack is launched on the ISA fleet, led by Radek and his elite Helghast battalion, again in the hopes of getting the launch codes. Most manage to evacuate the ship back to Helghan, but Templar fails to comply to Radek's demands and is executed as Radek downloads the codes before they're deleted. Templar, with his last ounce of strength, maneuvers the ship into the petrosite grid that destroys the ARC network, and we get possibly the worst bit of dialogue in the game.
They shot the colonel!
Dan! No! Rico! I'm not leaving without him! It's too late!
Back on Helghan, all of the survivors regroup to complete the mission, but before Alpha Squad can begin the assault on the palace, Visari nukes his own city with the warheads, killing not only the Helghan population there, but most of the ISA forces. Unfortunately, this is how it plays out though. You're going to tell me what happened through the level loader? With all the forces remaining, we begin an all-or-nothing assault on the palace, and as Alpha Squad enters, face off against Radek. We defeat him, but out of pure disgrace, he ends it himself and leaves Sev and Rico to go and arrest Visari, who was surprisingly upbeat about losing.
War's over, Visari. You lost.
Really, Sergeant? And who won? The cowards who commanded you and your comrades here to die? The Helghast have lost nothing. We fight for who we are. We wear our wounds like badges of honor. Helghan is ours, and we will die before we let it fall to plunderers.
Rico, having none of it, kills him on the spot, because that's what he does apparently. It's no self-control. And the game ends with an exhausted Sev leaving the palace, only to look above to see a large armada belonging to the Helghast, ready to attack what is left of the ISA invasion. That's the story for Killzone 2, and I'm sure if you watch my video on Killzone, yeah, there was a lot more to talk about here. What I love most about Killzone 2's story is we see more out of the Helghast. Not only do we get to see and hear more from Visari and the lengths he is willing to go to win this war, but we see what he was talking about before his death come quickly to fruition, and there was a great setup for Killzone 3. I don't know if I'd call it a great ending, but a good way to hype me up to revisit 3. But Radek is no joke either. Radek is a badass bitch from the jump, as we see him take out a ton of ISA with Helghast technology, to his interrogation scene, executing Templar, and our final fight against him. He's no joke. Is he the best written character? No. Is he a bit of a comic type villain? Yeah, but not only do you see how much of a threat he is through his actions, but you hear it in his tone of voice. I really enjoyed him as a villain. I loved being on Helghan as well. Where we heard it described in the original and how it led to the Helghast becoming the threat they are today, we actually got to see it. And it is a grim place, and not only is the story about a retaliation and waging war, but the game gets to feel like it because of how well they managed to capture the feeling of Helghan. On the ISA side, however, is where I have some problems. First of all, whilst Rico was somewhat reckless in Killzone, he was a little goofy, so it made for a bit of relief from all the seriousness. In Killzone 2 though, not only is he reckless, he's a straight up ass with no control over his emotions, which makes him a pain to be around. Alpha Squad is also a pretty forgettable cast of characters. They're just boring. I didn't feel any connection to these characters, so even in Gaza's death, a character you spend a good chunk of time with, I just didn't care. Not that the original Killzone had particularly good characters either, but it had a bit of intrigue surrounding Haka, and they replaced it here with nothing. I also didn't like the text in between levels that later was explained in dialogue anyway. Especially with the nuke. You read about it and then in-game they let you know what happened. Just set up the intrigue here in the loading screens and then proceed to tell us in-game. That part was a little lame. However, so I don't end the story segment being a bit of a Debbie Downer, the cutscenes are now all in engine, so the story flows a lot better between the cutscenes and the gameplay, and it just feels less jarring this time around. My last point is more of some jokes than criticisms or nitpicks, but these dropships seem to be the worst thought out vehicle. How do you stay on it? Just hold on for dear life? I don't know. I wouldn't feel safe on these things. Also, doesn't Sev look like the same height as the rest of the characters? I thought so too. So why in-game when I walk up to people do I feel like the PS3 inserted my actual height of 5'8"? I experience this view enough as it is, don't shrink me in my games also. Overall though, the story is a big improvement over the original, but still not perfect, mainly because the ISA are still pretty lame. The Helghast once again steal the show though, and it was great to not only see their home planet of Helghan, but see the lengths they're willing to go to win. Visari, once again voiced by Brian Cox, does an incredible job at making you pay attention to what he's saying. The game's setup is again captivating, and Radek is a badass villain. But my biggest issue replaying Killzone was the gameplay. So how did Killzone 2 address those issues?
Take out those tanks so we can move on!
I'm not going to beat around the bush here. Killzone 2's gameplay is leaps and bounds better than the original. The Helghast feel like a true threat to fight against this time around due to the improvements to their AI. We can see them change from cover to cover. If you shoot them or near them, they'll hesitate to peek their head around next time and change positions, and the different variations in types of Helghast really makes you pay attention because they all have different methods of attack. Obviously, we still face off against the standard Helghast with assault rifles or LMGs, but we also have almost kamikaze-like Helghast that'll rush in guns blazing. Easy enough to take out, but they'll come in a bit of a swarm. Shotgun and flamethrower troopers with a bit more armor, so you really need to make sure you maintain distance. The return of drone-like enemies that are much quicker this time around, and the big beefy tanks in which you need to headshot to expose their back, where they have an air tank and take them out that way. And yes, this enemy does feel a little silly as they consistently turn their back to you, but you know these guys aren't to be messed around with. They'll melt you. What makes all this variety so great is you know what enemy is what from the look alone, which helps you either plan your attack or crap your pants if they flank you. I always got especially worried when they pulled their knife on you, which is a one-hit kill. The animation alone made me panic. Like I said in the story, Killzone 2 feels like a war not only visually, like the attack on the palace which feels ripped straight from World War II, but there is just a lot more Helghast to fight this time around, so it's great to see the AI was fixed, which impacts how difficult the game can be. This game is no joke, and there will be moments you can get a little stuck on, like the final assault, but now having regenerating health and a functional checkpoint system, it takes that frustration out of the equation and just makes it feel like a fair fight. Killzone 2 is also much better to play in terms of its controls, but I'm not sure if that's because I got used to how the original game played or not, as there is still no aim assist and the control scheme is still a little funky. Seriously, L2 to crouch? Why? Let me change it. But here in Killzone 2, I did find myself hitting targets with more ease. The addition of scoping in probably helped that out a bit. And leaning and peeking around cover not only helps you with your gun's stability, but allows you to feel a bit safer in combat. It also feels like you are hitting your targets more with the Helghast reactions, which are heightened due to the fact these weapons actually feel like they pack a real punch. The shotgun especially is much better this time around, as it feels like it shreds through your enemies, but the ISA and Helghast assault rifle both feel much better to use with less recoil, which is appreciated, and throwing a grenade feels much better and actually goes a good distance with more speed. The highlights of the weapons though easily go to the flamethrower, which may be the best in any game, as it doesn't take much to incinerate the Helghast, and even though it does look a little like it's pissing flames, it allows you to get a bit more range in the attack and made it a weapon I frequently used. But the best weapon in the game is a positive and a negative. The electricity gun is so damn overpowered, it's incredible. It has unlimited ammo, it destroys the Helghast, and has good range to it. But you only get it for one level. Obviously, I understand why this is, because it is so good. It would have destroyed the balance, but maybe just one more time would have been awesome. But that gun was badass. We're not just foot soldiers anymore though, as we get moments in tanks, AA guns on the ship, and a mech. The AA guns were in Killzone, but just to kill Helghast, so I include this feature here because whilst not original, I mean it's a turret segment, it does help break up the standard gameplay loop, which is appreciated. But driving a tank and controlling a mech, the mech especially, makes you feel like you could take on the Helghast army on your lonesome, much like the electricity gun, and I love these moments letting you live in your own little power fantasy very sparingly, and they make you feel so great because when you are facing the Helghast in standard gameplay, there is that danger now because of the improvements to the Helghast, so for Guerrilla to let us have these breathers was a great touch. The game's sound design is also much improved, and instead of dead silence and muted sounds or repeated Helghast lines, we have crisp gun sound effects and the Helghast callouts to try and help you figure out what is going on with your enemy, and the soundtrack is more prominent, sometimes a little too prominent.
It's their planet this time. Keep your shit wide tight, okay?
I can't hear you!
But outside of cutscenes, the Killzone sound is noticeably Killzone, so I'm glad it got its time to shine more here. Killzone 2 does have 2 boss fights as well, which is where I think is the best point to jump into, really just my nitpicks for the gameplay. The drone boss fight is a little meh. It doesn't last long if you know what you're doing, as you shoot the electricity and shoot some rockets. But if you don't know that, you can be running around like a headless chook, trying to avoid the barrage of gunfire. Radic, on the other hand, is a little bit of a letdown. Before you can actually fight him one-on-one, you have to go through waves and waves of Helghast. Now again, thankfully the game's AI and controls have been fixed, so it is enjoyable to take out these swarms, but I wanted a badass final fight with Radic, not a damn near army of goons. Once we do fight Radic though, it improves significantly, as you need to listen for his teleporting and cloaking in and out of invisibility, because he does have a blade and will take you out quick. He feels like a true threat when you actually face him. It's just the horde mode before that lets the fight down on the whole. I also don't know why, but they removed the option for a third weapon, and you can't replace the pistol. So you get one interchangeable weapon, which sucks because it means guns like the bolt gun or the SMG I didn't really use all too much based on the usefulness of others. And I had to backtrack more if I picked up a gun for a certain situation, like the shotgun, but now needed my assault rifle again. I think they had it right in Killzone with 3 weapons. If you are going to limit me, I'd prefer a full arsenal all day, but that isn't always the case. So I don't know why they scrapped it, and better yet, why they won't let me get rid of my pistol for something better. Also, the 6-axis controls do feel a little gimmicky. They're not bad, they just get used a little too often for my liking. As I said though, to me these aspects of the gameplay feel more like nitpicks, because when I was in the game, I was having an absolute blast. Killzone 2 is a great game to this day. Whilst I questioned why I even liked the series to begin with after replaying Killzone, those questions were quickly answered while playing Killzone 2. Yes, the story does have its letdowns, especially in terms of the characters from our side of the war in the ISA, but the Helghast and their intrigue only grew. A lot more happens this time around in the story, and Guerrilla really leaned into that Wolfenstein sort of vibe with the Helghast, which I can always appreciate. But the gameplay is where you can tell Guerrilla Games listened and really heard the original game's criticisms, because this was a much better game to play with all the game's improvements and additions. Yes, it's a short campaign that should take you roughly 5 hours, but that will never be a negative to me, as I do enjoy a concise experience, especially revisiting games as the talk of pricing does become irrelevant. Killzone 2 holds up today incredibly well, and if you haven't played it yet, I do really recommend giving it a go, and it's only gotten me more excited to revisit Killzone 3. But for now, this has been my retrospective on Killzone 2.